The November rain hammered against the windows of the modest two-story house on Maple Street in Westerville, Ohio, creating a rhythmic percussion that had become the soundtrack of Laura Hensley's life. She stood at the kitchen sink, her hands submerged in lukewarm dishwater, staring blankly at the grey suburban landscape beyond the glass. At 42 years old, Laura felt decades older, as if the weight of her existence had compressed time itself into something dense and suffocating. "Laura, I need you." Nathan's voice carried from the master bedroom on the first floor, the same demanding tone she'd heard thousands of times over the past 4 years. She closed her eyes, counted to 5, and forced her face into a neutral expression before drying her hands on a faded kitchen towel. The house smelled of antiseptic and something else, something Laura had never quite identified but associated with prolonged immobility and despair. She walked through the living room, past the medical equipment that had transformed their home into a makeshift care facility, and entered the bedroom where her husband lay in the specialized hospital bed they'd purchased after insurance refused to cover the full cost. Nathan Hensley had been a different man 4 years ago. At 41, he'd been a construction supervisor, broad-shouldered and confident, with calloused hands and an easy laugh. Then came the accident on Interstate 270, a jackknifed semi-truck, black ice, and a split second that changed everything. The cervical spinal cord injury at C4 had left him tetraplegic, unable to move anything below his neck except for limited shoulder movement. He could breathe on his own, could speak, could feel sensations, but his body had become a prison, and Laura had become the warden. "I've been calling you for 10 minutes, Nathan said, his face flushed with frustration. The television mounted on the wall played a daytime talk show neither of them cared about. "I need to be repositioned. My left side is going numb." Laura moved to the bedside with practiced efficiency, her movements mechanical after years of repetition. She'd learned the proper techniques from occupational therapists, had mastered the art of preventing pressure sores, had become fluent in the vocabulary of catheters and bowel programs and range of motion exercises. She'd become a nurse, a physical therapist, a prisoner. "Better?" she asked after adjusting his position, her voice carefully modulated to hide any trace of resentment. "I guess," Nathan muttered, his eyes returning to the television screen. He didn't thank her. He never thanked her anymore. In the early days after the accident, he'd been apologetic, almost desperate in his gratitude for her dedication. But somewhere along the way, her care had become expected rather than appreciated, an obligation rather than a gift. Laura retreated to the kitchen and pulled out her phone, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. The text appeared instantly. "He's asleep by 9 usually. Can you call me then?" The response came within seconds. "Missing you. This is torture." She deleted the messages immediately, a habit she developed over the past 8 months. Marcus Webb was everything Nathan wasn't: mobile, spontaneous, alive. They'd met at the grocery store of all places, when Laura had been comparing prices on generic pain relievers, and he'd made a joke about the cost of staying healthy. He was 38, divorced, worked as a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company. He didn't know about Nathan, not at first. Laura had allowed herself 3 coffee dates before the truth had spilled out in a Starbucks parking lot, tears streaming down her face as she confessed to this virtual stranger that she was drowning. Marcus hadn't run. Instead, he'd listened, had held her hand across the center console of his Lexus, had told her that her feelings were valid and understandable, that she deserved happiness, that she deserved a life. The affair had begun 2 weeks later in a Hampton Inn, 30 miles from Westerville, far enough that Laura felt safe from prying eyes. The guilt had been overwhelming initially, but it had faded with each encounter, replaced by something she'd thought she'd lost forever: desire, passion, the electric thrill of being wanted. "Laura!" Nathan's voice again, cutting through her thoughts like a blade. The rain intensified outside, and Laura watched the water stream down the windows, distorting the world beyond into something unrecognizable. She thought about drowning, about what it would feel like to slip beneath the surface and let everything go. But drowning was just another form of prison, wasn't it? Another way of being trapped. She returned to Nathan's room, administered his evening medications, adjusted his position again, and listened to his complaints about the physical therapist who'd visited that morning. Laura nodded at appropriate intervals, made sympathetic sounds, and thought about Marcus's hands on her body, about the studio apartment he'd mentioned renting where they could spend entire weekends together. That night, after Nathan had finally fallen asleep with the help of medication, Laura sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open. The blue light illuminated her face as she typed searches into Google, her fingers hesitant at first, then more confident. Life insurance policy verification, car accident statistics Ohio, adaptive vehicle modifications, average settlement fatal car accident. She told herself she was just gathering information, just exploring hypothetical scenarios. But deep down, in a place she wasn't ready to fully acknowledge, a plan was beginning to form. A terrible, desperate plan, born from years of exhaustion and the suffocating weight of obligations she'd never chosen. The house creaked and settled around her. The rain continued its relentless assault on the roof. And somewhere in the darkness, Laura Hensley crossed an invisible line between fantasy and intention. She didn't know it yet, but in that moment, sitting at her kitchen table in suburban Ohio, she'd set in motion a sequence of events that would destroy multiple lives and reveal the terrifying lengths a desperate person will go to escape their circumstances. She closed the laptop, deleted her browser history out of habit, and went to bed beside the hospital bed where her husband slept, their two sleeping arrangements a perfect metaphor for the distance that had grown between them. As she lay in the darkness, listening to Nathan's steady breathing and the rain's constant drumbeat, Laura allowed herself to imagine a different life, one without medical equipment, without constant demands, without guilt. She imagined freedom, and in imagining it, she began to want it with a desperation that would prove fatal. The gray Ohio winter settled over Westerville like a heavy blanket, transforming the suburb into a monotonous landscape of bare trees and salt-stained roads. Laura had always hated winter, but this year the cold felt personal, as if nature itself was conspiring to trap her indoors with Nathan and the endless routine of caregiving that defined her existence. It was early December when she made the first concrete move toward what she'd been planning in the dark corners of her mind. She sat across from Gerald Mitchum, Nathan's insurance agent, in a cramped office that smelled of stale coffee and printer ink. Gerald was 63, balding, with the kind of permanent tan that came from golf courses rather than genuine outdoor work. "I just want to make sure everything is in order," Laura said, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart. "With Nathan's condition, I worry constantly about what would happen if something happened to him." Gerald nodded sympathetically, pulling up files on his computer screen. "Of course, Mrs. Hensley, it's completely understandable. Let me review the policy details with you." He adjusted his reading glasses and began reciting information Laura already knew by heart. "Nathan's life insurance policy is $2 million, with you listed as the sole beneficiary. It's a comprehensive policy that covers accidental death, natural causes, everything except suicide within the first 2 years, which has long passed. And there's no waiting period or investigation for accidental death," Laura asked, trying to sound casual. "Well, there's always some verification process," Gerald explained. The insurance company will request death certificates, medical records, police reports, if applicable. But for straightforward accidents, the payout is typically processed within 60 to 90 days. Is there something specific you're concerned about? Laura manufactured a worried expression she'd perfected over months of practice. I just want to know that if anything happened, God forbid, I'd be able to manage financially. The medical bills are overwhelming, and I've had to quit my job at the salon to care for him full-time. This was true. Laura had been a hairstylist at a popular salon in downtown Westerville before Nathan's accident. She'd loved the work, the creativity, the conversations, the satisfaction of transforming someone's appearance and watching their confidence bloom. That life felt like it belonged to someone else now, a stranger from a different era. Gerald leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. You're doing everything right, Laura. Nathan is lucky to have you. I've seen too many cases where spouses can't handle the strain and end up divorcing or abandoning their partners. What you're doing is truly admirable. The words cut deeper than Gerald could have known. Laura smiled and thanked him, then left the office with copies of the policy documents tucked into her purse. In her car, she sat for several minutes, staring at nothing, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. Admirable. The word echoed in her mind like an accusation. That evening, Marcus called while Nathan was engaged with the evening news. Laura retreated to the basement, the one space in the house where she could speak freely without being overheard. I can't do this anymore, she told him, her voice breaking. I can't live like this. I'm 42 years old, and I feel like my life is over. Marcus's voice was gentle through the phone. Come stay with me for the weekend. We'll figure something out. There are programs, facilities that specialize in long-term care for patients like Nathan. You don't have to do this alone. But Laura had researched those facilities. The good ones cost upward of $8,000 per month, far beyond what Nathan's disability payments would cover. The affordable ones were nightmares of neglect and abuse that she couldn't condemn even Nathan to, despite everything. It's not that simple, she said quietly. Then what do you want to do? Marcus asked. Laura closed her eyes, the basement's concrete walls seeming to press in around her. I don't know, she lied. I just need time to think. But she did know. The plan had been taking shape for weeks, growing more detailed with each passing day. She'd been researching adaptive vehicle modifications, learning about the hand controls that allowed quadriplegics to drive specially equipped vehicles. Nathan had mentioned wanting such modifications made to his old Ford Explorer, which sat unused in the garage. He'd talked about reclaiming some independence, about being able to go to doctor's appointments without relying on Laura or expensive medical transport services. What if, Laura had thought, those modifications were made incorrectly? What if there was a malfunction? What if Nathan, attempting to drive for the first time in years, lost control and crashed? The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. Nathan would be behind the wheel. He would be the one driving. Any accident would appear to be the result of his limited physical capabilities or mechanical failure. A tragedy, not a crime. Over the next 3 weeks, Laura set the pieces in motion with calculated precision. She found a company in Columbus that specialized in adaptive vehicle modifications and scheduled a consultation, explaining that her husband was eager to regain his driving independence. The technicians were professional and thorough, installing hand controls that would allow Nathan to accelerate and brake without using his legs. The installation cost $6,000. Money Laura borrowed against a credit card, telling herself it was an investment in their future. Though the future she imagined was vastly different from what the technicians assumed. She watched the installation process carefully, asked detailed questions, and learned exactly how the system worked. The hand controls were sophisticated, but not foolproof. They required coordination and practice, especially for someone who hadn't driven in 4 years. "Your husband will need extensive training before he drives on public roads," the lead technician warned. "We recommend at least 20 hours of practice in controlled environments with a certified instructor." "Of course," Laura agreed. "We'll be very careful." But careful was the last thing Laura intended to be. On a grey afternoon in late December, Laura sat in the Explorer in their garage, familiarizing herself with the hand controls. She practiced accelerating and braking, getting a feel for the sensitivity of the system. The vehicle responded smoothly, predictably. She needed to understand it completely because what she was planning required perfect execution. Nathan was thrilled when Laura told him the modifications were complete. For the first time in months, she saw genuine excitement in his eyes, a flash of the man he'd been before the accident. "When can I try it?" he asked eagerly. "Soon," Laura promised. "Let me practice with it first. Make sure everything works properly. I want your first drive to be safe and successful." She spent the next week taking the Explorer out on quiet suburban streets, always alone, always watching for traffic cameras. Westerville had several intersections equipped with red light cameras, and Laura memorized their locations meticulously. She identified routes that would avoid surveillance, back roads where accidents might occur without digital witnesses. She also researched the mechanics of car crashes, reading accident reports and medical journals about impact injuries. She learned that deaths from single-vehicle collisions typically resulted from high speeds, lack of seatbelt use, or particularly vulnerable impact angles. She studied trees along various routes, identifying which ones were sturdy enough to cause catastrophic damage. The planning consumed her, filling the empty spaces in her mind that had once held dreams of a normal life. She told herself she was just being thorough, just exploring possibilities, but she knew the truth. She was preparing to kill her husband. Marcus noticed the change in her demeanor during their increasingly rare encounters. "You seem distant," he said one afternoon in his apartment. "What's going on?" Laura looked at him. This man who represented freedom and passion and all the things she'd lost, and considered telling him everything, but she knew what would happen if she did. Marcus was a good person, fundamentally decent. He would try to talk her out of it, would probably end their relationship out of moral obligation or self-preservation. So she kissed him instead and said, "I'm just stressed, but things are going to get better soon, I promise." She meant it. Things would get better once Nathan was gone, once she had the insurance money, once she was free to build a new life with Marcus. They could move away from Westerville, maybe to North Carolina where Marcus had family. She could open her own salon, something upscale and boutique. They could travel, make love without guilt, wake up without the crushing weight of obligation. All she had to do was drive a car into a tree. Late at night, alone in the kitchen while Nathan slept, Laura would sometimes allow herself to feel the full weight of what she was contemplating. Murder. The word felt heavy and foreign, incompatible with her self-image as a caring wife, a good person who'd sacrificed years of her life for her husband's well-being. But was it really murder if Nathan's life had essentially ended 4 years ago? Wasn't she just concluding something that was already over? The rationalizations came easily in the darkness, smooth and seductive. What Laura didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that her careful planning had a fatal flaw. In her focus on avoiding traffic cameras and choosing the perfect crash location, she'd overlooked a detail that would ultimately unravel everything. The proliferation of private security cameras, doorbell cameras, and dash cameras that had transformed suburban America into a surveillance network far more comprehensive than any official system. January arrived with brutal cold, the kind that made the air hurt to breathe and transformed exhaled breath into visible clouds. Laura had decided on a date, January 15th, a Thursday. She'd chosen it carefully, far enough into the new year that holiday traffic would have normalized, but not so far that she'd lose her nerve. The night before, she barely slept. She lay in her bed adjacent to Nathan's hospital bed, listening to the house settle and creak, wondering if this was how condemned prisoners felt in their final hours. Except she wasn't the prisoner. Nathan was, and she was about to set them both free. Marcus had texted earlier that evening, "Thinking about you. Want to grab lunch tomorrow?" She'd replied simply, "Can't tomorrow. Soon though. I love you." It was the first time she'd written those words to him. She needed to believe in something beyond what she was about to do, needed to anchor herself to a future that justified the terrible present. Morning came with grey skies that threatened snow. Laura went through the motions of Nathan's morning routine: medications, catheter care, breakfast fed one careful spoonful at a time. He was in good spirits, talking about a documentary he wanted to watch later and asking if his brother might visit over the weekend. "Maybe," Laura said, her voice sounding strange in her own ears. "We'll see how the week goes." At 10:47 a.m., Laura told Nathan she needed to run errands and would be back in a couple of hours. She'd arranged for Denise, a home health aide who came twice a week, to stay with him, an alibi detail she'd planned weeks in advance. "Could you also pick up my prescription at CVS?" Nathan asked. "I think I'm running low on the muscle relaxants." "Of course," Laura said, kissing his forehead with practiced tenderness. She wondered if this would be the last time she'd touch him, if this moment would haunt her for the rest of her life. But the thought was quickly suppressed, buried beneath the layers of rationalization she'd constructed. She drove the Explorer out of the garage, waving to Mrs. Patterson, who was collecting her mail across the street. Everything had to appear completely normal. Laura headed east on Schrock Road, her hands steady on the wheel despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The route she'd chosen would take her along a stretch of County Road 317, a winding two-lane road that ran through a semi-rural area on the outskirts of Westerville. She'd driven it a dozen times in preparation, had identified the perfect spot, a slight curve where a massive oak tree stood approximately 15 feet from the road's edge, positioned at an angle that would make a collision appear plausible for a driver with limited mobility experiencing mechanical failure or medical distress. But first, she needed to establish her alibi. Laura drove to a Target in a strip mall, parked in clear view of the store's exterior cameras, and went inside. She purchased a few household items, paper towels, laundry detergent, nothing memorable, and made sure to chat with the cashier about the cold weather. The receipt would be time-stamped, placing her miles away from where the accident would occur. From Target, she drove to a residential area she'd scouted previously, a neighborhood with minimal traffic and no obvious security cameras. She parked on a quiet street and waited, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. This was the point of no return. Once she drove to County Road 317 and executed the plan, there would be no going back. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "You okay?" The simple question almost broke her. She typed and deleted 3 different responses before settling on, "Fine, just a busy day." At 1:15 p.m., Laura drove toward County Road 317. The sky had darkened further, and a light snow had begun to fall. Perfect conditions, she thought, for explaining loss of control. She pulled over about a mile from the target location and made the final preparations. She removed her seatbelt. This was crucial. The impact needed to appear severe enough to explain serious injury or death, and an unbuckled seatbelt would support that narrative. She took several deep breaths, visualizing exactly what she needed to do. Accelerate hard down the straight section approaching the curve, then deliberately drive off the road toward the oak tree. At the last possible second, she would hit the brakes, enough to leave skid marks suggesting an attempt to stop, but not enough to prevent the collision. The physics were delicate, too fast, and she might kill herself. Too slow, and the damage wouldn't be sufficient. She'd calculated that approximately 45 miles per hour should produce catastrophic vehicle damage while potentially allowing her to survive with airbag deployment and proper body positioning. Laura pulled back onto County Road 317 and accelerated. The Explorer's engine responded smoothly as she pressed the hand control. 40 miles per hour. 45. The curve approached, and the massive oak tree came into view, its winter-bare branches reaching toward the grey sky like skeletal fingers. Her hands gripped the wheel. Her foot hovered near the brake pedal, ready to reinforce the hand control if needed. The rational part of her brain screamed that this was insane, that she was about to deliberately crash a vehicle, that she could die, that she was attempting murder. But the desperate part, the part that had been dying slowly for 4 years, suffocated by obligation and trapped in a life she'd never chosen, that part pressed harder on the hand control. 50 miles per hour. The tree rushed toward her, impossibly large, impossibly solid. This was it, the moment that would change everything. Laura cranked the wheel hard to the right, sending the Explorer off the road. The tires hit the gravel shoulder, and for a split second, she experienced a strange sense of calm, as if time had slowed, and she was observing rather than participating in what was happening. Then, instinct overrode everything. At the last possible moment, some primal survival mechanism in Laura's brain seized control. Her hands jerked the wheel left, her foot slammed on the brake alongside the hand control, and the Explorer decelerated violently. The anti-lock brakes engaged with a juddering sensation as the vehicle skidded sideways. The impact with the oak tree occurred at approximately 28 miles per hour instead of the planned 45, and at an oblique angle rather than head-on. The right front quarter panel crumpled with a sickening crunch of metal and glass. The airbag deployed, hitting Laura in the face with stunning force. The seatbelt, which she'd removed, wasn't there to restrain her, and she was thrown forward into the airbag before being snapped back into the seat. Pain exploded through her chest and face. The world spun, disoriented and chaotic. Steam or smoke, Laura couldn't tell which, rose from the crumpled hood. The engine had died and an eerie silence descended, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and Laura's ragged breathing. She'd failed. The survival instinct had sabotaged everything. The crash wasn't severe enough. There was no way this would be mistaken for a fatal accident. Nathan wasn't even in the vehicle. Panic seized her as the full implications crashed down. She just deliberately crashed a car. There would be an accident report, an investigation. How would she explain this? What possible story could account for why she was driving Nathan's specially adapted vehicle alone and had driven off the road into a tree? Through her dazed state, Laura heard a voice. "Ma'am? Ma'am, are you okay? I'm calling 911. A man was running toward the Explorer from a house she hadn't noticed, a house with a clear view of the road, a house that probably had cameras, a house that had witnessed everything. Laura's mind raced, trying to construct a narrative, an explanation. She'd been distracted. Her phone. Yes, she'd dropped her phone and reached down to grab it, lost control. That could work. That had to work. But as she struggled to form coherent thoughts, as the adrenaline began to ebb and the reality of what she'd just done and failed to do settled over her like a suffocating blanket, Laura Hensley realized with crystalline clarity that she'd made a catastrophic mistake. Not just in the execution of the crash, but in ever conceiving of this plan at all. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the cold January air, each wail a harbinger of the unraveling that was about to begin. Laura touched her face, felt blood from where the airbag had split her lip, and tasted copper and defeat. She'd wanted freedom. Instead, she'd driven herself directly into a prison of her own making, one with walls far stronger than the obligations she'd been desperate to escape. And the worst part, the part that would haunt her through everything that came next, was that Nathan was still alive, still in their house, still dependent on her care, completely unaware that his wife had just tried and failed to murder him. The emergency room at Riverside Methodist Hospital was a fluorescent-lit maze of curtained cubicles and antiseptic efficiency. Laura sat on an examination table while a young nurse with kind eyes cleaned the cut on her lip and assessed her for injuries. Her chest ached from the airbag impact, and she'd have bruising for weeks, but nothing was broken. Physically, she'd survived relatively unscathed. Emotionally and legally, she was about to face devastation she couldn't yet comprehend. "You're very lucky," the nurse said, applying butterfly stitches. "At the speed you must have been going, this could have been so much worse." Laura nodded mechanically, her mind spinning through the story she'd rehearsed with the paramedics and would now have to repeat to the police officer she knew would be coming. She'd dropped her phone. She'd reached for it. She'd lost control on the slick road. It was an accident, a moment of distraction that could happen to anyone. But even as she mentally rehearsed the narrative, doubt gnawed at her. Had the man who'd witnessed the crash seen her deliberately swerve? Had he noticed anything suspicious? She'd been too disoriented to gauge his expression or pay attention to what he might have observed. Mrs. Hensley, a tall man in his 40s, entered the cubicle wearing a Westerville Police Department uniform. His name tag read Officer K. Reynolds. His face was professionally neutral, neither hostile nor sympathetic. "I'm glad to see you're all right. I need to ask you some questions about the accident." Laura's mouth went dry. "Of course." Officer Reynolds pulled out a small notebook. "Can you walk me through what happened?" Laura delivered her prepared story, keeping her voice steady, making eye contact, adding small details that seemed authentic. The song that had been playing on the radio, the way the snow had been falling harder, her worry about Nathan's prescription that she still needed to pick up. Reynolds wrote everything down, his pen scratching across the paper in a rhythm that felt accusatory to Laura's paranoid mind. When she finished, he looked up, his expression unchanged. "Were you speeding?" "I don't think so. Maybe a little over the limit. The conditions were getting worse, and I just wanted to get home." "And your phone? Where was it when you reached for it?" Laura hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "On the passenger seat. It had fallen off when I made a turn earlier." "I see." Reynolds made another note. "We'll need to examine your phone as part of the accident report. Standard procedure." Panic flared in Laura's chest. Her phone. The deleted messages with Marcus. Were they truly deleted, or could digital forensics recover them? She'd read somewhere that nothing was ever truly erased from electronic devices. "Of course," she managed. "Whatever you need. And I understand this is your husband's vehicle, the one with adaptive modifications for his disability." "Yes. Nathan. My husband. He's tetraplegic. We had the modifications installed so he could eventually drive again. But he hasn't started using it yet. I've been practicing with it to make sure everything works properly." Reynolds nodded, still writing. "That must be difficult, caring for him full time." There was something in his tone, not quite suspicion, but not quite sympathy either. Laura couldn't read it, and the ambiguity terrified her. "It has its challenges," she said carefully, "but he's my husband, for better or worse." The irony of those words wasn't lost on her. For better or worse. She'd just tried to orchestrate worse into permanent. After another 20 minutes of questions, Reynolds closed his notebook and handed her his card. "We'll be in touch if we need any additional information. Your vehicle has been towed to the impound lot. You'll need to contact your insurance company to begin the claims process." "Thank you, officer." As Reynolds left, Laura sagged against the examination table. Relief and terror warring within her, she'd gotten through the initial questioning. Her story was consistent. Unless there was evidence contradicting her account, she might actually get away with this, except she hadn't accomplished anything except crashing a car and raising potential suspicions. Denise, the home health aide, picked Laura up from the hospital and drove her home in uncomfortable silence. Laura had called her from the ER, explaining the accident in vague terms, asking her to stay with Nathan a few more hours. Denise had agreed, but seemed troubled, casting sidelong glances at Laura during the drive that suggested unspoken questions. When they arrived at the house on Maple Street, Laura's heart sank. A Westerville police cruiser was parked in the driveway. "They came about an hour ago," Denise said quietly. "Asked to speak with Nathan. I told them you'd be home soon." Laura's legs felt unsteady as she walked to the front door. Inside, she found Officer Reynolds sitting in the living room with Nathan, who looked confused and worried in his hospital bed, which had been adjusted to a more upright position for the conversation. "Laura!" Nathan's voice was tight with concern. "What happened? Are you okay? Officer Reynolds said you crashed the Explorer." "I'm fine," Laura said, moving to his bedside and taking his hand, an automatic gesture that felt surreal given what she'd attempted just hours ago. "Just shaken up. I dropped my phone and reached for it, lost control on the slick road. I'm so sorry about the car." Nathan's eyes searched her face, looking for injuries beyond the obvious cut on her lip. "The car doesn't matter. I was terrified something serious had happened to you." The genuine concern in his voice was a knife twisting in Laura's gut. Despite everything, the exhaustion, the resentment, the slow death of their marriage, Nathan still cared about her. Perhaps he still loved her in whatever capacity his limited world allowed. And she had just tried to kill him. Officer Reynolds stood, his presence a reminder that this conversation was far from private. "I was just explaining the situation to your husband, Mrs. Hensley. I wanted him to know about the accident in case he heard about it from other sources." "I appreciate that," Laura said, though she suspected Reynolds' motivation was less about courtesy and more about observing their interaction, looking for inconsistencies or suspicious reactions. After Reynolds left, Laura helped Denise with Nathan's afternoon care routine, then paid her for the extra hours and sent her home. Alone with Nathan, Laura felt the weight of the day pressing down on her like a physical force. "I'm glad you're okay," Nathan said softly. "I know this hasn't been easy, learning to drive with those hand controls. Maybe we should get you some professional training before you practice anymore." "Maybe," Laura agreed, unable to meet his eyes. That night, after Nathan fell asleep, Laura sat in the darkened kitchen with her laptop, her hands trembling as she searched for information about accident investigations, digital forensics, and surveillance footage. The rabbit hole went deep and terrifying. She learned about traffic cameras she'd never considered, about the way modern vehicles store data in event recorders, about the sophisticated techniques police used to reconstruct accidents and determine causation. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Haven't heard from you all day. Everything okay?" Laura stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Had a car accident. I'm fine, but pretty shaken up. Need some space for a few days." "Jesus, Laura, do you need anything? Should I come over?" "No, don't come here. I'll call you when I can." She set the phone down and buried her face in her hands, the full scope of her situation crashing over her. She'd failed to execute her plan, but had created a paper trail of suspicious behavior. The insurance inquiry with Gerald, the vehicle modifications, the accident itself. If anyone looked closely enough, patterns might emerge. But worse than the fear of discovery was the crushing realization that she'd crossed a line she could never uncross. She'd sat in that Explorer, pointed it at a tree, and pressed the accelerator with murderous intent. The fact that her survival instinct had overridden that intent at the last second didn't change the fundamental truth. She was capable of murder. What kind of person did that make her? Over the next 3 days, Laura tried to return to normal routines, but normalcy felt like a costume that no longer fit. She cared for Nathan with the same mechanical efficiency, but now every interaction was colored by guilt and the secret knowledge of what she'd tried to do. She jumped at every phone call, expecting police, investigators, accusations. On the 4th day, Officer Reynolds returned, this time accompanied by another detective, Detective Sarah Chen from the Major Crimes Unit, a woman in her late 30s with sharp eyes and an air of casual authority that immediately put Laura on edge. "Mrs. Hensley, we have some follow-up questions about the accident," Detective Chen said. "Is there somewhere we can talk privately?" Laura's heart hammered against her ribs. Of course, the kitchen. They sat around the same table where Laura had researched her murder plot, and the irony wasn't lost on her. Detective Chen pulled out a tablet and turned it toward Laura. "Mrs. Hensley, we've been reviewing traffic camera footage and private security camera footage from homes along County Road 317. I'd like you to look at this video." The screen showed grainy footage from what appeared to be a doorbell camera capturing a partial view of the road. Laura watched herself drive past in the Explorer, moving at what appeared to be normal speed. The video continued, and seconds later showed the vehicle returning in the opposite direction. The angle wasn't perfect, but the deceleration before the crash was visible. Laura's blood turned to ice. "This footage is from approximately 200 yards from where you crashed," Chen continued, her voice neutral but her eyes laser-focused on Laura's reaction. "It shows your vehicle passing by twice within a 15-minute window, and it clearly shows you braking significantly before the impact. That contradicts your statement that you lost control and couldn't stop." Laura's mind raced, searching for an explanation, any plausible reason for what the video showed. I did brake. I saw the tree coming and tried to stop. That's what I meant when I said I lost control. I was braking but couldn't stop in time. Except your initial statement suggested you didn't see the tree until it was too late," Reynolds interjected. "You told me the accident happened so fast you barely had time to react." The walls were closing in. Laura could feel the trap tightening, could see the suspicion crystallizing in the detective's expressions. "I was in shock," Laura said, her voice rising slightly with desperation. "I may not have remembered everything clearly in the hospital. The details were jumbled." Detective Chen exchanged a glance with Reynolds, then looked back at Laura. "Mrs. Hensley, I'm going to be direct with you. This accident doesn't add up. The vehicle modifications, the insurance inquiry you made 3 weeks ago, the fact that you were alone in your disabled husband's car, the trajectory of the crash, and now video evidence suggesting deliberate deceleration. These elements paint a concerning picture." "I don't understand what you're implying," Laura said, though she understood perfectly. "I think you do," Chen replied quietly, "and I think you need to decide whether you want to tell us the truth now or wait until our investigation uncovers it." Laura sat frozen at the kitchen table, the tablet still displaying the damning footage. Her mind scrambled for any possible explanation that wouldn't unravel the carefully constructed lie she'd been living. But Detective Chen's penetrating gaze suggested that the time for lies was rapidly running out. "I want to speak with a lawyer," Laura said quietly, the words feeling like both a surrender and a lifeline. Detective Chen nodded, unsurprised. "That's certainly your right, Mrs. Hensley. But I want you to understand something. We're going to examine every aspect of this incident. Your phone records, your financial transactions, your internet search history, your communications. If there's something you want to tell us before we find it ourselves, now would be the time." The threat was clear and professionally delivered. Laura's deleted text messages with Marcus, her Google searches about car accidents and insurance policies, the credit card charges for the vehicle modifications, all of it would eventually surface like bodies rising from deep water. "I have nothing to say without an attorney present," Laura repeated, her voice steadier than she felt. After the detectives left, Laura sat in the kitchen for nearly an hour, paralyzed by the magnitude of what was happening. From the living room, she could hear the television Nathan was watching, some nature documentary about ocean predators. The narrator's voice droned on, about sharks and their evolutionary perfection as hunters. Laura felt like prey that had just realized it was being stalked. She called Marcus from the basement, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. "I need to see you," she said when he answered. "Now, can you meet me?" "Laura, what's going on? You sound terrified." "I can't explain over the phone, please. The Starbucks on Polaris Parkway in 20 minutes. She told Nathan she needed to run to the pharmacy and left Denise with him again, promising she'd only be gone an hour. The home health aide was beginning to give her increasingly suspicious looks, as if she sensed something fundamentally wrong beneath the surface of Laura's explanations. Marcus was already waiting in his Lexus when Laura arrived. She got in the passenger seat, and the familiar scent of his cologne, something expensive and masculine, hit her with a wave of associations. Hotel rooms, afternoon escapes, the fantasy life she'd constructed around their affair. "Tell me what's happening," Marcus said, his hand reaching for hers. And Laura told him everything. The plan to stage Nathan's death, the modified vehicle, the failed crash, the police investigation that was closing in. She watched his expression shift from concern to shock to something that looked like horror. When she finished, Marcus pulled his hand away, his jaw tight. "Jesus Christ, Laura. You tried to kill your husband?" "I didn't go through with it," Laura said desperately. "I couldn't. At the last second, I braked. I couldn't do it." "But you planned it. You modified his car. You researched how to do it. You drove to that location with the intention of crashing. That's attempted murder." The words hung in the air between them, stark and undeniable. Attempted murder. Laura had been avoiding that specific terminology in her own mind, softening it with euphemisms and rationalizations, but Marcus had cut through all of that with brutal clarity. "I was desperate," Laura whispered. "You don't know what it's been like living in that house, watching my entire life disappear while I empty catheter bags and prevent bed sores and listen to the same complaints day after day. I'm 42 years old, and I feel like I'm already dead." "So your solution was to actually kill someone?" Marcus's voice was rising, anger and fear mixing into something caustic. "Did you think about what would happen to you if you got caught? Did you think about me, about how this would affect me?" The selfishness of his response should have shocked Laura, but instead it clarified something she'd been avoiding. Marcus wasn't her salvation. He was an escape fantasy, a middle-aged divorced man who liked the excitement of an affair, but clearly had no interest in being implicated in anything criminal. "I thought you loved me," Laura said bitterly. "I cared about you. I still do. But this?" He gestured vaguely, encompassing the enormity of what she'd confessed. "This is insane. I can't be involved in this." "You're already involved. We've been having an affair for 8 months. The police are going to find our messages, our hotel receipts. They're going to question you." Marcus's face went pale. "I'll tell them I had no knowledge of any plan, that you never mentioned anything like this to me." "That's true," Laura said coldly. "I never did tell you, because somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew you'd react exactly like this." They sat in silence for several minutes, the Starbucks parking lot bustling around them with people living normal lives, ordering coffee, checking phones, completely unaware that inside the Lexus, a woman's life was disintegrating in real time. "What are you going to do?" Marcus finally asked. I don't know. Get a lawyer. Hope there's not enough evidence to charge me with anything. Is there enough evidence? Laura thought about the video footage, her internet searches, the insurance inquiry, the timeline that would show her purchasing vehicle modifications and then crashing weeks later. She thought about her phone, currently in police custody, being examined by forensic technicians who could probably recover every deleted message, every damning search query. Probably, she admitted. Marcus started the car. I think you should go. I'm sorry, Laura. I really am. But I can't be part of this. Laura got out of the Lexus and watched him drive away, the red taillights disappearing into traffic. She'd lost Marcus, lost her fantasy of escape, lost any illusion that she could somehow emerge from this situation unscathed. She sat in her own car for a long time, crying until her eyes were swollen and her throat ached. Then she drove home to the house on Maple Street, to Nathan and Denise, and the life she'd tried so desperately to escape. Over the next week, Laura retained an attorney, Robert Kellerman, a criminal defense lawyer in his 50s with a reputation for taking difficult cases. He was expensive, requiring a $20,000 retainer that Laura had to borrow against the house. When she explained the situation to him, Kellerman listened without visible judgment, taking detailed notes. Here's what we're dealing with, he said after she'd finished. The physical evidence is circumstantial. The video shows you braking, which could support either a loss of control or a last-second decision not to go through with something. Your internet searches are problematic, but not definitive. Lots of people research morbid topics without acting on them. The insurance inquiry could be explained as legitimate concern for your family's financial security. But, Laura prompted, hearing the unspoken caveat, but if they have communications between you and anyone else discussing the plan, or if they find more specific searches that demonstrate clear intent, or if they can establish a financial or romantic motive, things get much more complicated. Tell me about Marcus Webb. Laura explained the affair, watching Kellerman's expression tighten with each detail. They're going to find him, Kellerman said, and when they do, they'll paint a picture of a woman desperate to escape her marriage, motivated by both freedom and a $2 million insurance payout. The prosecution will argue you planned to kill your disabled husband to start a new life with your lover and his life insurance money. But I didn't actually hurt him. Nathan's fine. Doesn't that matter? It matters for sentencing, not for charges. In Ohio, attempted murder doesn't require the victim to be injured, only that you took substantial steps toward committing murder with intent. Deliberately crashing a vehicle with what you believed was your husband inside absolutely qualifies. He wasn't in the car, Laura said quietly. Kellerman looked up sharply. What? Nathan wasn't in the vehicle. I was alone. I was going to fake a crash with him in it. But I did a practice run first to make sure I could pull it off. That's when I got caught. The lawyer leaned back in his chair, reassessing. So you crashed alone, intending to... What? Do it again later with Nathan inside? I don't know. Maybe. I hadn't worked out all the details. Laura's voice cracked. I know how this sounds. I know what I am. But in that moment, driving toward that tree, some part of me still couldn't do it. Some part of me is still human. That's not a legal defense, Kellerman said, but his tone had softened slightly. But it might help us negotiate if charges are filed. The fact that you ultimately didn't go through with it, that you braked, that Nathan was never actually in danger, those factors could potentially reduce this from attempted murder to something lesser. Reckless endangerment, perhaps, or even just insurance fraud, if we can argue you were planning to fake an accident for financial gain without actually intending to harm anyone. It was a thin lifeline, but Laura grasped it desperately. 2 days later, Detective Chen called and asked Laura to come to the station for another interview. Kellerman accompanied her, and they sat across from Chen and Officer Reynolds in a small, windowless interrogation room that smelled of stale coffee and institutional cleaning products. "Mrs. Hensley, we've completed our analysis of your phone and computer," Chen began, sliding a folder across the table. "We recovered deleted text messages between you and Marcus Webb, including several that reference being trapped and wanting to start over. We also found your search history, which includes queries about vehicle accidents, insurance policies, and interestingly, the specific dosages of medications your husband takes." Laura felt Kellerman tense beside her, but he said nothing, waiting for Chen to continue. "We've also obtained your financial records, which show the $6,000 charge for vehicle modifications made on a credit card you'd maxed out. You borrowed that money despite being in significant debt from medical expenses. Why would you do that if you were planning for Nathan to actually use the vehicle?" "My client declines to answer that question," Kellerman interjected. Chen nodded, as if she'd expected that response. "We've interviewed Marcus Webb. He confirmed the affair and stated that you frequently expressed feeling suffocated by your caregiving responsibilities. He also mentioned that in one conversation you said, and I quote, 'Sometimes I wish Nathan would just die so I could be free.'" Laura's stomach dropped. Marcus had betrayed her, had given them ammunition in exchange for distancing himself from her crimes. "Lots of caregivers express frustration," Kellerman said. "That's not evidence of intent to murder." "No," Chen agreed, "but combined with everything else, it establishes motive, and we have one more piece of evidence that's particularly compelling." She pulled out another tablet and queued up additional security footage. This video was from a different angle, a home camera Laura hadn't known existed. It showed the Explorer making a three-point turn on County Road 317, then driving back past the camera toward the crash site. Clear evidence that Laura had been deliberately positioning herself, not just passing through. "You made a practice run," Chen said. "You drove past the crash site, turned around, and came back to execute your plan. That demonstrates premeditation and deliberation. Mrs. Hensley, based on the totality of the evidence, we're prepared to charge you with attempted murder of your husband, Nathan Hensley." The room seemed to tilt. Laura heard Kellerman speaking, his voice professional and measured, discussing bail and arraignment procedures. But the words were distant, muffled, as if she were underwater. She was going to be arrested, charged with attempted murder. Her life, what remained of it, was over. "However," Chen continued, and that single word cut through Laura's spiraling thoughts, "the prosecutor's office is willing to consider a plea agreement, given certain factors. Your husband was never actually in the vehicle. You did brake significantly before impact, and you have no prior criminal history. If you're willing to cooperate fully, admit to your actions, and accept responsibility, we can discuss reducing the charges." Laura looked at Kellerman, who gave her a small nod. This was the moment of truth. Confess and potentially receive leniency, or maintain her denials and face the full weight of the criminal justice system. "What kind of reduction?" Kellerman asked. "Voluntary manslaughter reduced to attempted voluntary manslaughter, with a recommended sentence of 15 to 20 years, eligible for parole after serving 85%. 15 to 20 years. Laura would be in her late 50s or early 60s when she got out. Nathan would probably be dead by then from complications of his condition. Her entire life would have been consumed by this catastrophic mistake. But it was better than life in prison for murder. "I need time to discuss this with my client," Kellerman said. The decision to accept the plea deal took 3 agonizing weeks, during which Laura existed in a state of suspended animation, neither fully arrested nor fully free. She remained in the house with Nathan, continuing the caregiving routines that had driven her to desperation. But now every interaction was colored by the knowledge that she'd be leaving soon, not to freedom, but to prison. Nathan didn't know. Laura couldn't bring herself to tell him, couldn't face the betrayal and hurt that would inevitably fill his eyes when he learned what she'd tried to do. So she continued the charade, administering medications, managing his care, and dying a little more inside each day. Kellerman worked to negotiate the best possible terms. The prosecution insisted on attempted murder charges, refusing to reduce it further. The evidence was simply too strong. The video footage showing premeditation, the deleted messages establishing motive, the insurance inquiry demonstrating financial incentive, and Marcus's testimony providing the emotional context. They're offering 35 years, Kellerman told Laura during a meeting at his office, with the possibility of parole after 25. It's the best we're going to get. If we go to trial and lose, you're looking at life without parole. Laura stared at the plea agreement document on the desk between them, the legal language reducing her catastrophic choices to bureaucratic prose. 35 years. She'd be 77 years old when she was eligible for parole. Her entire life condensed into a series of terrible decisions and one moment of desperate action. "What happens to Nathan?" she asked quietly. "His family will need to arrange care. He'll likely need to be placed in a long-term care facility. The state may help cover costs, since you won't be able to." Laura thought about Nathan alone in some institutional setting, depending on underpaid, overworked staff for his most basic needs. She'd resented caring for him, had felt suffocated by the obligations, but at least she'd provided quality care. At least she'd ensured his dignity. Now he'd lose even that because of her actions. "When do I have to decide?" Laura asked. "The offer expires in 48 hours. After that, they'll proceed with formal charges and we'll be looking at trial." Laura signed the plea agreement that afternoon. There seemed little point in delaying the inevitable. The arraignment was scheduled for March 12th. Laura had to tell Nathan before then. He'd find out through news coverage anyway. The story had already begun circulating through local media. Westerville woman accused of attempting to murder disabled husband, though details remained limited due to the ongoing legal proceedings. On the evening of March 9th, after completing Nathan's nighttime routine, Laura sat beside his hospital bed and took his hand. He looked at her curiously, perhaps sensing that something significant was about to happen. "I need to tell you something," Laura began, her voice already cracking, "and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." Nathan's expression shifted to concern. "What's wrong? Are you sick?" "No, not sick." Laura took a shuddering breath. "The car accident in January, it wasn't an accident. I planned it. I was going to stage a crash with you in the car, make it look like mechanical failure or driver error. I wanted to kill you, Nathan. I wanted you dead so I could collect your life insurance and start a new life." The words hung in the air between them, each syllable a small detonation. Nathan's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally something that looked like devastating comprehension. "No," he whispered. "No, Laura, that's not. You wouldn't. But I would. I did. I had the vehicle modifications installed specifically for that purpose. I researched how to do it, where to do it, how to make it look convincing. I drove to that location, intending to crash the car with you inside." Tears streamed down Laura's face, but she forced herself to continue. "I couldn't go through with it. At the last second, I braked, but the intention was there. The plan was real." Nathan was crying now too, silent tears sliding down his cheeks as he processed the magnitude of her betrayal. "Why?" he managed. "Why would you want me dead?" "Because I was drowning," Laura said, the words pouring out in a torrent. "Because every day felt like dying, trapped in this house, watching my life disappear while I emptied your catheter and turned you every 2 hours and listened to your complaints. because I felt like I'd ceased to exist as a person and had become just your caregiver. Because I was having an affair with someone who made me feel alive again, and I wanted to be with him instead of you. The honesty was brutal, each truth a knife cutting through whatever remained of their marriage. But Laura was past the point of protective lies. You were having an affair? Nathan's voice was hollow. For 8 months. His name is Marcus. I met him at the grocery store, and he represented everything you couldn't be anymore. Mobile, spontaneous, free. I fell in love with him, or what I thought was love. And I convinced myself that you'd be better off dead, that I'd be doing us both a favor by ending this awful existence we were trapped in. Nathan turned his head away from her, staring at the wall. Get out, he said quietly. Nathan, get out. Oh, his voice cracked with anguish and rage. Get out of my room. I can't look at you right now. Laura stood on shaking legs and retreated to the kitchen, where she collapsed into a chair and sobbed until her body ached. She'd expected anger, had prepared herself for Nathan's hatred, but actually seeing the devastation on his face was worse than anything she'd imagined. She slept on the couch that night, and when morning came, Nathan refused to speak to her. Denise arrived for her shift and immediately sensed the tension. Laura pulled her aside and explained that she'd be going to jail soon, that Nathan would need alternative care arrangements, that everything was falling apart. Denise listened with wide eyes, then said quietly, I wondered. You seemed so distant lately, so haunted. I thought maybe you were depressed or sick. I never imagined that I was a monster, Laura finished bitterly. I was going to say desperate, Denise replied. I've worked with dozens of caregivers over the years, Mrs. Hensley. I've seen what it does to people, especially spouses. The burnout, the resentment, the way they lose themselves in the role. Most people don't act on those dark thoughts, but I've seen enough to know that almost everyone has them. The small mercy in Denise's words didn't absolve Laura of her crimes, but it reminded her that she wasn't uniquely evil, just uniquely foolish enough to have acted on impulses that others successfully suppressed. Nathan's brother David arrived from Cleveland that afternoon after Nathan had called him, explaining through tears what Laura had done. David was 48, a successful accountant with a wife and 3 kids, and he looked at Laura with undisguised contempt. I'm taking over Nathan's care, David said coldly. I'm moving him to an assisted living facility in Cleveland where my family can visit regularly. You're not to contact him, not to come near him. If I have my way, I'll make sure your name is never spoken in his presence again. That's fair, Laura said quietly. She had no right to argue, no grounds to object. She'd forfeited any claim to Nathan's life when she'd pointed his modified vehicle at that oak tree. The arrangements happened quickly. Within 3 days, Nathan was transferred to a high-quality assisted living facility that specialized in spinal cord injury care. David had consulted with lawyers about filing for divorce on Nathan's behalf and securing a restraining order against Laura. The house on Maple Street would be sold to help cover Nathan's care costs. Laura spent her final days of freedom in an increasingly empty house, surrounded by boxes and the ghosts of her failed life. Marcus never contacted her again. She'd heard through the grapevine that he'd moved to North Carolina, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the scandal. On the morning of March 12th, Laura dressed in conservative clothing and drove to the courthouse with Kellerman. The building was imposing, all concrete and glass, representing the implacable machinery of justice that was about to consume her life. The courtroom was surprisingly full. Local news stations had sent reporters, and there were spectators drawn by the sensational nature of the case. A wife trying to murder her disabled husband. Laura kept her eyes down as she entered, not wanting to see the judgment on their faces. Judge Patricia Morrison presided, A stern woman in her 60s with iron-grey hair and an expression that suggested she'd seen every variety of human failing. The proceedings were formal and efficient. The charges were read: attempted murder, insurance fraud, reckless endangerment. Laura entered her guilty plea in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. "Mrs. Hensley," Judge Morrison said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, "before I accept this plea and proceed to sentencing, I want to make sure you understand what you're admitting to. You planned and attempted to execute the murder of your husband, a vulnerable person completely dependent on your care. You betrayed the most fundamental trust that exists in a marriage. Do you understand the gravity of these actions?" "Yes, Your Honor," Laura managed. "And do you enter this plea freely and voluntarily, understanding that you're waiving your right to trial?" "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Morrison nodded slowly, then spent several minutes reviewing the plea agreement, the evidence summary, and the sentencing recommendations. Finally, she looked directly at Laura. "Mrs. Hensley, I've presided over thousands of cases in my career, and I've learned that human beings are capable of both extraordinary kindness and shocking cruelty, sometimes within the same person. Your situation is tragic on multiple levels. For your husband, who must now cope with not only his disability, but also the knowledge that the person he trusted most wanted him dead. For you, as a caregiver who became so overwhelmed that you lost your moral compass. And for society, which must grapple with the reality that our support systems for caregivers are woefully inadequate. However, understanding the pressures you faced does not excuse what you did. You had options. You could have sought respite care, could have explored alternative living arrangements, could have been honest with your husband about your struggles. Instead, you chose to plan and attempt murder. That choice has consequences." Judge Morrison paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the courtroom. "I hereby sentence you to 35 years in the Ohio Reformatory for Women, with eligibility for parole after serving 25 years. You'll receive credit for time served from today. Additionally, you're ordered to pay restitution to your husband for psychological damages in the amount of $50,000, to be paid from any future earnings or assets. You're permanently barred from contacting Nathan Hensley or his family members. Do you understand this sentence?" "Yes, Your Honor," Laura said, tears streaming down her face. As court officers approached to take her into custody, Laura glanced back one final time at the courtroom gallery. In the back row, she saw a face she recognized: Mrs. Patterson, their elderly neighbor from Maple Street. The old woman's expression wasn't hateful or judgmental. Instead, she looked sad, as if witnessing the conclusion of a tragedy she'd seen unfolding but had been powerless to prevent. Laura was led from the courtroom through a side door, the sounds of the proceedings fading behind her. She was processed, fingerprinted, photographed, and stripped of her civilian clothes in exchange for prison-issue khakis. The transformation from Laura Hensley, caregiver and wife, to inmate 4487293 was mechanical and dehumanizing. That night, in a holding cell before transfer to the main facility, Laura lay on a thin mattress and stared at the ceiling, trying to comprehend the reality of her situation. 35 years. She'd be an old woman when she got out if she lived that long. Her entire life had been compressed into this consequence, this punishment for a crime she'd attempted but failed to complete. She thought about Nathan, wondered if he was adjusting to his new facility, if David and his family were visiting, if he'd eventually find some measure of peace despite what she'd done to him. She hoped so. Nathan deserved better than the betrayal she'd inflicted. She thought about Marcus, living his life in North Carolina, probably dating again, maybe finding someone new. Their affair seemed like a fever dream now, a delusion she'd constructed to justify the unjustifiable. And she thought about that moment on County Road 317 when her hands had jerked the wheel and her foot had slammed the brake, when some fundamental part of her humanity had reasserted itself against the monstrous plan she'd conceived. That moment had saved Nathan's life, but hadn't saved her from the consequences of her intentions. In the end, Laura realized she'd gotten exactly what she'd wanted: freedom from caregiving, from the house on Maple Street, from the crushing weight of obligation. But the freedom came in a form she'd never anticipated. The freedom of having nothing left to lose, nothing left to protect, no illusions remaining about who she was or what she'd been capable of doing. It was the freedom of complete devastation. And as Laura finally drifted into restless sleep in that holding cell, she understood that this freedom, this terrible, isolating, consequence-laden freedom, would be her companion for the next quarter century. A reminder that sometimes the worst prisons are the ones we build for ourselves through our own desperate, terrible choices. The story of Laura and Nathan Hensley would eventually fade from local news cycles, replaced by other tragedies and scandals. But for those involved, for Nathan learning to trust again in his new facility, for David and his family grappling with the knowledge of what almost happened, for the investigators who'd pieced together the attempted murder, and for Laura herself serving her decades-long sentence, the reverberations would continue indefinitely. Because some betrayals are too profound to ever fully heal, and some choices, once made, can never be unmade.